This episode of Ouzo Talk is brought to you by Kingsford Smith Transport. Have a group that needs transporting? KST has you covered with their fleet of professionally maintained buses and coaches, catering from 9 to 57 passengers and driven by experienced drivers. Visit kstbuses.com.au to talk to the team and make your booking. Kingsford Smith Transport, proud sponsors of the Ouzo Talk podcast. There's no Ouzo Talk without a bottle of Ouzo, which is why we love the Greek Providore. Get a real taste of the very best produce that Greece has to offer. From olive oils and delicious artisan sweets to unique spirits, earthy herbs and memorable wines. Visit thegreekprovidore.com.au to see their amazing range. The Greek Providore, proud sponsors of the Ouzo Talk podcast.
Sound is.
Nick Athanasiou, welcome back to another episode of Ouzo Talk, post-Olympics I might add.
Definitely, mate. Look, it's great to be back, and we're going to have a great episode in store. We've been planning this for a while, haven't we?
We've been talking about this one for ages, and in fact, the last time that we tried to get this guest, and well, not tried, we did get this guest. The original plan was to actually do this episode, but given the stature of the guest that we have, we thought it would probably be a good idea to do a sort of broader ancient Greece episode first before we did a deep dive into our topic today, which is Alexander the Great.
That's right, aka Alex the G.
Alex the G. Which is not a term that we coined. We actually borrowed it from one of the emails from our guest today, which is, I'm not going to bury the lead any longer. Professor Paul Cartledge from Cambridge University in the UK. Welcome to Ouzo Talk for the second time.
Thank you both. Lovely to see you. I know one of you's not been so well, and I'm really pleased that you're recovered and that we're recording.
Guilty as charged. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, that was one of my biggest fears, that we wouldn't be able to do this episode. So thankfully, everything lined up, and Paul was gracious enough to allow us to do this episode again. And again, Paul is one of these amazing historians and academics who is, I mean, you can go back and listen to the last episode for the full biography, but you know, as I said last episode, he means a lot to me in terms of my knowledge of ancient Greece, Nick, and I know he's very important to you too.
100%. Look, I think we mentioned the last episode, he's like the Everest of ancient Greece. You know,
it doesn't go
the
higher.
Olympus.
It can't get higher than you, Paul.
Yeah.
Olympus,
yeah, Olympus is higher than Everest. I'll take that.
And Everest is high, but Olympus is where the gods live. So, yeah.
Correct.
That's right.
Good point. Good point. Well, Paul, now that we have you, we have you here, and we mentioned the Olympics have just finished. What did you make of them, just quickly?
No, well, congratulations to Oz for, I think, beating us. We slipped down the table on the last day, but no, I watched quite a lot, and I suppose my standout was the 800 metres that Keely Hodgkinson won. She led from the front. She was targeted by the other runners and yet managed to hold them off. The 100 metres men's, when everyone ran under 10 seconds, and that's, I think, the first time ever. That's absolutely unbelievable. I also like the diving. I don't know about you guys, but I thought the whole thing was beautifully managed. I thought the opening ceremony was too long, and it was a great shame about the weather, and also the E. coli in the Seine, which is not brilliant. And one Irish athlete
That's not ideal.
Has gone down with something bad, come back from Paris, and he's suffering from the after effects, having swum quite a long way in the Seine. But what did you guys think?
Look, we love the result. Australia did awesome again. I think it's our best Olympics ever now, as in gold medal tally. Look, I really enjoyed it thoroughly. You know, the range of sports. There were some unusual ones there. There was some unusual Australian athletes there in the breakdancing, which shall go down in folklore history now, which is
or infamy.
Well,
no, I really enjoyed it.
It's an oddity because they've only had it this time. And then when it goes back to the States, to LA in 2028, you'd have expected breaking would have been continued. But for some reason, it's not on the program in Los Angeles.
But what is making a comeback in Los Angeles is cricket. And cricket was last played in... was it 1900 in Paris, I think? That was the last time it was. So it was an Olympic sport, one of the originals, I guess, in 1900.
The big difference between the ancient games and ours is that they, the ancients, had no team sports whatsoever. So anything that involves a relay or anything that involves a team, that wasn't an Olympic sport.
Well, we said it in our last episode that was dedicated to the Olympics. I mean, we nominated sports that we thought should be removed from the modern Olympics.
Oh.
There was consensus on synchronized swimming for some reason. As far as I'm concerned, you can't have an Olympics where there's Muay Thai, but there's not Bagration or pankration, however you want to pronounce it.
Well, there's another criterion which could be used, which is if it requires artistic, aesthetic, subjective judgment, it shouldn't be an Olympic event. If it's not clear who's done what, who's won, who's not won, then it shouldn't be an Olympic sport. I mean, that's the criterion. Yeah.
Well, let's ask you the same question. We're going off script here, but let's ask you the same question. Would you like to see Paul Cartledge, the Olympics return to Greece permanently?
Oh, yeah. I mean, no question. I don't think it can be an Olympia simply because of logistics. It's far out, as you know, to the west of Greece, and it would be a bit of a hassle. There's no major airport nearby or whatever. But Athens, yes, forever and ever. Why not? And it would save time, save money. It would be congenial. It would be authentic in some degree. It's not completely authentic, but it would be for the modern Olympics absolutely fine. I mean, no doubt whatsoever about that.
We can end the episode now. Then that's it.
Okay.
It's over, Paul. we'll drink to that.
Fantastic.
Guys.
Well, we're off to a flying start.
Very good.
No bias whatsoever.
Quite.
Well, look, fantastic start. We should kick things off officially now, Nick. What do you reckon?
I think so, Tom. Let's have a drink.
Siniamas.
Thank you.
No. It's a little early in the day for me to drink Uzaki, but yeah.
Well, you're drinking spirit with us in spirit, as they say.
Again,
Siniamas.
Nice. I love it.
And we need to reiterate the fact that, although Paul is not
with us in the studio.
Well, not only that, he's not Greek, but he is Greek.
I'm Greek in
really
spirit.
Is.
That's debatable. Some people might say he's more Greek than Greeks.
You've just proved the point.
It's a compliment.
You speak Greek better than most Greeks I know.
No, go on.
Well, Nick, do the honours. What are we actually drinking today?
Well, because it's still winter here in Sydney and it is pretty cold, we tend to shift over to Tsikodia or Tsipro. But thanks to the Greek Providore again, they've given us this amazing bottle from Crete, 35N. Tsikodia with muscat and spinas. It's a quality, Paul. I'm
Absolutely.
sure you might have that in the UK somewhere. But it's going down a treat for us, keeping us warm.
The Cretans are doing well, let me tell you, when it comes to distilling this stuff. And again, we say it every episode, these bottles, I mean, it looks like that sort of, what is it, the Navy strength gin or Navy proof or whatever they call it.
Navy rum, yeah.
It looks quite similar.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I have
absolutely.
I've got on the go a bottle of Raki, which is, I think, a little grade one above even Tsikodia.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Is it from Crete?
It is. Apokriti, no.
There you go.
It is.
That's how you know it's authentic.
It is.
Fantastic.
Absolutely.
And just to say, cheers. And I think you're mentioning you never really got sick. You only just got sick recently because you stopped drinking that.
I'd gone a few months without getting sick, which is an absolute rarity in my household with two young children. So I put it down to this stuff and the regular consumption of it in moderation, of course.
Just one shot is all you need, one shot a day. And I haven't been sick all winter, mind you. So far, so good.
Well,
so a shot a day.
Tipaxilo, as they say. Knock on wood.
Knock on wood.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we have another sponsor on this episode as well, don't we, Nick?
Definitely. Yeah. Look, we've got to thank Kingsford Smith Transport. George Mavrokordatos again. If it wasn't for people like that, we wouldn't have these episodes going, wouldn't we, Tom?
That's right. That's right. And again, these guys help out with all sorts of buses. And interestingly enough, Nick, since the guys have come on board, I've been seeing their buses everywhere. That's no word of a lie. I've seen their buses everywhere, doing school trips and whatnot. Again, we've spoken about the fact that they do the church trips, they do all of these things.
Yeah.
Guys, get in contact with them. You need a bus, you've got a tour group, you've got whatever it is. Get in contact with KST Transport.
Yeah, definitely. Well said. And it's funny you say that. I see them too now. Yeah. Now that they're on board, I notice them everywhere. I go, oh, shit, there's another one.
Yeah.
Another one. They're everywhere. Well done, George.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, guys. So thank you, KST, the Greek Providore. You guys are amazing. Thank you for making this podcast possible. Now,
I'm drinking to that again.
Please do. Now, look, we're going to pick up where we left off last episode, Paul. As we said, we want to talk about Alexander the Great. And one of the key things when it comes to Alex the G, as we said, is that there has been a little bit of debate over the years, particularly with our friends and colleagues in North Macedonia when it comes to his heritage. The last time you were on this podcast, we asked you very bluntly, is he Greek or Hellenic? Let's start there again. What is the evidence, and what is your perception of this?
Okay, so he spoke Greek. He has Greek ancestry. The North Macedonian Republic is in a part of that near to Macedonia, Greek Macedonia, where the Paeonians lived. The Paeonians were not Greeks. They were conquered by Alexander's father, Philip. And so there's absolutely no question about the claim of North Macedonia being, shall we say, inappropriate. He is not a North Macedonian. He's a Macedonian. And the one piece of evidence which I always cite, it's going way back before his birth. He was born in the 4th century BC in 356, in the 300s before Christ, or before the Common Era. But going back to the 7th century, so to the 600s, and the early part of it, a famous poet called Hesiod, and he's sometimes been called the equivalent of a Bible for the Greeks, in the sense that he set out the duties, the powers of all the gods and goddesses, and he wrote a book called the Theogony. Well, another of his works survives only in quotations, in fragments, but one key bit of it where he's talking about the ancestry of the Hellenes. So Greeks always, if they're called Hellenes, then there must have been once upon a time somebody called Hellene, who is the ultimate ancestor in the direct paternity line of all Hellenes. So go right back up to the top of the Greeks' family tree, and you'll find a guy called Macedon. Well, that's 7th century. This is before anybody had an interest either in inventing the Macedonians or trying to deny that they were Greeks. And there's a very strong tendency in the 5th and 4th centuries to deny that they were Greeks, because people in the south didn't like them very much. And there was one sort of halfway house, and it's I think a confusion or a complication rather than a fact, that the Macedonian royal house, which was based in the east of the Macedonian area, the Macedonian royal house traced itself back to a man called Argeas. And so in the usual Greek way, they were the Argeadai, which means sons of or descendants of Argeas. And then they went further and said, why was Argeas called Argeas? Because he came from Argos, and that's in the Peloponnese, and absolutely no question that the people of Argos were Greeks. And in fact, Homer, who never uses the word Hellene, he never speaks of the Greeks, interestingly, one of his 3 words for Greeks is Argives, Argaioi. So at any rate, if you want to be in any doubt about the Hellenicity of Alexander, cease to be, do not even consider it, because for all sorts of reasons, the Macedonians collectively, the Macedonian royal house, were Hellenes.
There you go.
There you go.
Thoughts on that, Nicholas?
Look, I don't think anyone could have articulated the way Paul did.
Well, to be fair, I've never heard anyone articulate it like quite like that. I mean, that goes right back to the roots of
Yeah.
of Hellenicity, as you said.
Yeah.
A great word.
What I found interesting was did you call them the Paeonian race or
Paeonians,
people?
Pioneers.
Paeonian,
Yes.
pioneers.
Yeah, pioneers, yeah.
So who were they and what language did they speak?
We don't know because they have left us none of their writing. And I should have added, I will add now, one of the arguments against the Macedonians being entirely Greek, such that there's no question but that they were all Greek, is that their language, their native dialect, what you might call their idiolect, was larded with, it contained lots of loan words that were not Greek, and they came not from the Paeonians on the west, but from the Thracians to the north and to the east of them, Thrakes. And the Thracians lived in what's roughly Bulgaria today, and Philip conquered them as well. And so Alexander's inheritance in terms of geopolitics is the entirety of the northern Greek sphere moving up towards the Danube. He himself campaigned to extend his kingdom even further north up to the Danube. He liked to have a river as it were natural frontier. So you've got the Paeonians on the west and you've got the Thracians on the east, and we're not able to read either. We know much more about Thracian because Thracian words and so on are used by Greeks, they're quoted by Greeks, but Thracian texts as such have not survived. And there's one reason for that, which is that the lingua franca, as we say, the common language of the North Balkans was Greek, but it was Macedonian Greek as opposed to Athenian Greek or Spartan Greek. So because the Macedonian dialect was incomprehensible to someone from, let's say, Athens or Sparta, the way they talked among themselves, that was a reason for saying, oh no, that's Makedonisti and that's not Greek, that's Macedonian. And so on the other side, all their written texts that survive, the inscriptions, the epitaphs, the regulations for how you must behave in a gymnasium and so on, all standard Greek. So there's absolutely no question but that any Macedonian Greek who was literate in standard Greek, not Macedonian dialect Greek.
Wow.
Very interesting.
But you just brought some interesting points. I was going to ask, how do you behave in a gymnasium? But before we get to that, you mentioned Macedonia was named after a guy called Macedon. Was he from Argos? Where was he from? Where did he originate?
This is simply a family tree. It's, if you like, plucked from the air, but it's a systematization of general views which are not yet written down for the first time. Hesiod in the new alphabetic Greek. I should have added Hesiod comes from central Greece, from Boeotia, from a place called Askra, which is quite near the hill, the Valley of the Muses and Kitharon and all that. Lots of literary associations for the place that he came from. But Hesiod has Macedon as a brother, or I think it's a brother, of Ione. Well, if you know your Greek dialects, Ionic, and then, of course, aesthetically Ionic columns, that is a linguistic branch of the Hellenic people. There are three main branches: Aeolic, which is the language that Hesiod spoke; Ionic, which is the language that, let's say, Pericles spoke, Attic Ionic; and Doric, which is the language of the Spartans. And the Macedonians' dialect was closest to Doric, not Ionic, not Aeolic, but closest to Doric. And that sort of backs up the Macedonians' own view that the founder of the royal family of Macedon was a man called Argeas because he came from Argos. Now, this is what we call myth history. It's legend. Mythos means a tale, a traditional tale. Doesn't mean it's false. It doesn't mean it's a lie. It just means it's something that's traditionally believed and repeated. And so the Macedonian royal, if you like, propaganda, who founded our royal house? Argeas, who came from Argos in the Peloponnese.
I mean, you just mentioned the word mythos there. You know, I can't help but think I recently read our friend Stephen Fry's book, Mythos, of the same name. Amazing book. I'm not sure if you've read that book, Paul.
I have, and I've just been corresponding with him today. He's a friend of mine, and we share a passion for cricket as well as for ancient Greece.
Yes.
Anyway, we were talking about various things together, but I thought you were going to say beer, Tom, because of course a very good beer in Greece is mythos.
Quality.
So, Quality.
You can see the divide between us here now, Paul. He thought the beer, and I was thinking the book.
Yeah, I thought the beer.
Well, bravo you.
Well, we are Ouzo Talk. So I tend to drink more, and Tom tends to talk more. So I'm the Ouzo, you're the talk bit. Is that right? Or
probably. But look, as another academic friend of ours, Professor Vrasidas Karalis from Sydney University says, it's all about isoropia, balance.
Oh, right,
yes,
balance.
We do need to have that balance.
It's a great word, absolutely.
Particularly when it comes to the ancient Greeks.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Wow. Well, let's get stuck into Alexander the Great, Alex the G, as you've called him. So where do we begin? So do you want to maybe tell us, I guess, where he was born? And I'm more interested, was he more like his mother or his father growing up?
Right. Well, let me just bang my own trumpet for a little bit, which is I wrote a book published about 20 years ago now. I mean, time moves on. And I subtitled it The Hunt for a New Past. That was meant to be a pun because Alexander loved hunting. And he hunted wild boar, he hunted lions, goodness knows what. At any rate, his parents were Philippos. The Macedonians pronounce that Bilippos. The PH becomes a B sound. And his mother was Olympias, and she was Greek in the sense that she wasn't Macedonian Greek. She came from Epirus, from the royal family of the Molossi, which is roughly southern Albania, that bit of Epirus on the border between Albania and Greece. And they were
It's a great place.
They were alleged to have met first on Samothraki, which is an island in the North Aegean, not that far from eastern Macedonia. And they were both worshipping the great gods up there. It's a mystery cult. You get initiated. And this is all, I suspect, a little bit fairy tale romance. Most marriages of that sort, dynastic, between two royal families, royal houses, were not love matches. They were geopolitical, they were strategic. And it was very useful to Philip to have a wife from the furthest west bit. If he were to contemplate expanding to the west, which of course he did, all the way to the Adriatic, then, well, let's have Molossi, which is just in that part of the world on our side through the royal house. And his daughter, Cleopatra, Philip and Olympias had a daughter, and they married her off to Olympias's brother. So you can see a double sort of unification of the two royal houses. Unfortunately, the occasion of the marriage of Cleopatra to Alexander, another Alexander, Alexandros of the Molossi, was the occasion for his assassination. And that's, I think, a very salient point. What sort of a monarchy was it? How legitimate was it? How stable was it? Well, it was legitimate in the sense that the royal house could trace its ancestry back through, I think, about 7 generations. It goes back to a man called Timenos in the 7th century BC, the 6th. And so Philip, we're talking about in the early part of the 4th century, the 300s. So by the time he came to the throne, which was because his older brother had been killed in battle against another bunch of non-Greek neighbours, the Macedonian Greeks were often fighting their next-door neighbours who were not Greek in the north. So Philip came to the throne unexpectedly because he wasn't the oldest son, and he came to the throne in 359. He married Olympias a couple of years later, so he was already king when he married, and he'd been born in 382, so he was in his 20s. And he married in 357, gave birth, they had Alexander in 356. So, terrific occasion. When Alexander was born, one of three messages that reached Philip was, Alexander, you have a son. Secondly, your Premier General has just won yet another battle against yet another bunch of non-Greek neighbours. And thirdly, your horse has won an Olympic wreath. There was only a victory. You didn't have a second or third, and you didn't have a value prize at the ancient Olympics. You got an olive wreath. Your horse has won the horse race at the Olympics. And of course, that was very Greek. The Olympics were all Greek. They were pan-Hellenic. And Philip was going to go on, I mean, we're speaking somewhat in hindsight, to conquer all mainland Greece, to make himself the first ruler of a united Greece since Agamemnon. And Agamemnon, we think, is probably mythical in Homer's Iliad. So Philip's going to make the most of victories in pan-Hellenic athletics and equestrian events, and he did indeed do that. So we've got to Alexander's birth, 356.
So he was called Alexander the Second, is that right?
Third.
And who was the first?
He was the third.
Oh, he was the third.
So
and who was before him? Who was the first and
Okay,
second?
the first one is very, very interesting. And this is a little bit shocking, so trigger warning here. When Alexander was on the throne, the first, between the 490s and the 450s, he reigned for 40 years. In the middle of that, as I'm sure every good Greek knows, the Persians invaded Greece twice, 490 BC and 480-479, to try to add mainland Greece to the Persian Empire, which is going to become a very salient point of our discussion later on of Alexander. They failed. They were beaten at Marathon by the Athenians and the Plataeans, and they were beaten 480-479 in Salamis, a naval defeat, Plataea, a military defeat on land, and Mycale, a amphibious engagement on the coast of what's today Turkey. Well, now, Alexander features, Alexander I, in the history of the Persian Wars by Herodotus. Herodotus, the first historian, really, of Greece, indeed the first historian in the whole wide world, in the sense that here's somebody telling not just a story, not just propaganda, but fact-based and evaluative, without an agenda except to explain why, extraordinarily, a few Greeks were able to resist and defeat this vast horde of non-Greek invaders from the east. At any rate, point of the story, Alexander I, king of Macedon, was then a subject of Persia. Before the Persians invaded, the kingdom of Macedon had become a vassal state of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. So Alexander, as presented by Herodotus, is in a sticky position. He's caught. He's a Greek, but he's on the wrong side. And he makes the best of it by trying to, this is in Herodotus, persuade the Greeks to, as it were, give up. Don't fight it out. And he got into trouble after the victory, because why didn't the Macedonians fight on the side of the Greeks? They were on the wrong side. And this was a very big stain on the Macedonian royal house, one which Philip and Alexander were exceptionally keen to rid themselves of. And that's one motivation. There are many, but one motivation for their anti-Persianism was because of their ancestral guilt about being on the wrong side in the Persian wars of the 480s. Yeah.
How do we see this in the lives of Philip and Alexander III? Are they making very direct attempts to right the wrongs of their ancestors?
Well, absolutely. So I mentioned before that Philip was very keen to magnify anything that he achieved in a pan-Hellenic, all-Greek context. There are some of us, this is slightly disputed, but I think that as early as 346, so that's 10 whole years before he actually declared war on Persia, but as early as 346, he had in mind a Persian invasion, some sort of expedition into Asia, which would liberate Greeks from the Persian Empire. And that was a major propaganda point, and indeed a serious realism point. I mean, it actually was the case that Alexander, when he did go over 334 BC, he liberated many Greeks who'd been living in Western Asia, Anatolia, for hundreds of years, since at least about 1000 BC, so 600 plus years. They had been in the Persian Empire since the early part of the 4th century BC. The century before, the Athenians had fought to liberate those Greeks and had to some degree succeeded. Then along comes Sparta, who then sells those Greeks back to Persia in return for Persian money against the Athenians. This is very Greek. I'm sorry about that.
Spartans.
Well, you did give us a trigger warning.
So I want to touch on Alexander the Great's upbringing now. So before we get to Philip and Alexander's relationship, it sounds like Alexander had like an amazing education growing up. He had the best of everything.
Yeah, he had two main, what we'd call tutors, I suppose, both free, interestingly, not slaves. If you were an Athenian and you were well off, you could have a household slave, somebody you owned, who very likely wasn't Greek, but of course was Greek-speaking, who would then be your kind of teacher and your tutor. But Philip and Olympias hired two Greeks to teach, I mean non-Macedonian Greeks, to teach him. And one of them in particular, a man called Leonidas, he was very fond of. So that many years later, when he was in Asia, he's campaigning, he would keep in touch with him. It's very interesting. We hear about correspondence between Alexander and his early tutors. But the one, I suppose, is most famous, and this is something that particularly appeals to me, but when he was about 13, Alexander was given for his main, now we would say, higher education teacher, not quite university level, but secondary level, but high grade, Aristotle. Now, Aristotle was the son of the royal physician to Philip's father. Amyntas III had a physician, a Greek from Olynthos and from Stegaira, which is just that part of what's called Chalkidiki, the sort of claw that goes down south into the North Aegean. And he hired this man, Nicomachus, who was Aristotle's father. So Aristotle was hired when Alexander was 13 by Philip, I think partly because of that personal connection between his father and his father's physician. Aristotle was a genius, probably the smartest guy in the entirety of the Greek world at that period, and one of the smartest guys ever. And unlike his father, who was a practicing doctor, yes, Aristotle was very, very interested in medicine, in biology, and in botany, and goodness knows what. But he was a universal genius. So he was a kind of polymath who was more interested in teaching and researching than in practicing any particular profession. And he set up a school in Athens later, and it was in a grove, a sacred area called the Lykion, which is still the Greek word for a lycée in French, an educational institute. And so Aristotle's school has terrific descendants. Lots and lots of people looked back. They commented on his work. And still today, people think Aristotle is worth reading, not only for his scientific works, but also for his moral, philosophical works. At any rate, we don't know what Aristotle taught Alexander. He was in Pella, which is the capital of Macedon, for about a year. And one assumes that he will have taught him something about botany, biology, marine biology, as well as other animal biology, human and animal, and philosophy and logic and mathematics, Aristotle covered the waterfront. So whatever Alexander learned or whatever he derived from him, he will have been given a terrific grounding in all sorts of things. And there's one particular thing much later on. Alexander goes off to Asia in the wake of his father's assassination to go and conquer the Persians. And he carries with him a text. Now, this is slightly problematic because, as you know, ancient Greek texts were written on papyrus rolls. So not books, but rolls. And the Iliad is a very, very long poem, divided up later into 24 books. Well, the sources say, the biographers of Alexander, that he carried with him a text of the entirety of the Iliad, which Aristotle had marked up for him. He probably didn't write it because probably a slave actually did the physical labor of writing out the 15,000 verses of the Iliad. But Aristotle obviously said, now note this, Alexander, this is a really important passage, that sort of thing. And he allegedly slept on that text of the Iliad wherever he went. He was devoted to it. It was, I think, mainly or partly at any rate because of Achilles. Alexander sort of saw himself as a latter-day Achilles. Achilles come back to life.
I mean, it's an interesting comparison to make too, because I find it difficult to disassociate the two in some instances. It's very interesting, but I mean, when it comes to the quality of the tutor that we're talking about here in terms of Aristotle, in modern day terms, what would that be equivalent to? I'm struggling to come up with a comparison. Like, if you were to have a tutor of the same thing, the only person that I could sort of think of that would be comparable, it'd be like a combination of like an Elon Musk or a Professor Stephen Hawking or something like that.
Well, you're right.
This is like the best of the best, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think Musk is a good analogy because though he's smart, he's nothing like Aristotle in that he's far, far too emotional, not nearly enough dispassionate and rational. And whatever Aristotle was, he held some bad views, let's be honest, by our standards of women, for example, and of slaves.
Sure.
He thought there were some people who were just slavish by nature, that's okay. And then he thought all women were inferior in some key aspect of their intellect, their reasoning power, to all men. I mean, these are really backward views. But he was not pragmatic in the way that Musk is a hands-on entrepreneur. On the other hand, he does share Musk's love of science. And so the important thing in a way is the natural science plus arts and humanities, which Aristotle combined all of those. Alexander, frankly, was less of an intellectual than he was a man of action. So whatever he actually learned, I think probably much more important was what he put into effect in terms of being a pragmatic leader of men. And Aristotle could have helped him to some degree. What are the virtues? What counts as being a good leader? Can you become a good leader, or are you born a good leader? He discusses all those. So there isn't a royal road from Aristotle to Alexander, and then you can explain why Alexander's the way he is. But no doubt Aristotle had some influence on him.
He certainly went to the right schools, though, didn't he?
He did.
Look, I just want to touch on his athleticism. What kind of an athlete was Alexander the Great? And he mentioned some of the rules about joining a gym. What was all that about?
Yeah, the gyms was a general Greek thing, gymnasion. It's where you exercise naked, and typically you wrestle. You do some physical exercises that are on your own, but when you're into a contact discipline, it's typically wrestling. And we think wrestling today probably is not very high class, but in ancient Greece it was actually a very upper class sort of thing to do, because how many poor peasants have the time, the leisure, the money to attend a gym? Now, a gym is not what we understand today with lots of equipment. It's an open air space with sand so that when you fall you don't break your bones, and not much in the way of equipment. But the Macedonians were like other Greeks, the royal family like other Greeks, that they would wrestle, box, jump and run. Alexander I, we talked about him, he did compete at Olympia in the Olympics, and there was an issue, whether or not he would be eligible to compete, and he did, but he didn't win. Alexander is said to have said, yes, I'll enter a race, even at the Olympics, but only if all my fellow competitors are also kings. Now, I think that means probably he wasn't the fastest of fast runners, and that his main skills were in the saddle, except they didn't have saddles. So on horseback, Alexander was a brilliant horseman and a horse whisperer, a horse manager. He instinctively understood horseback riding, and he had one particular horse that he used as his charger, his stallion, and this guy, this horse, he was with for many, many years together. So in other words, he broke him when he was still a colt, and then rode him as his war horse ever thereafter, until he died in what's today Pakistan. His name was Bukephalas, which means ox head, Bukephalos, and because he had a blaze on his muzzle, a white blaze in the shape of an ox head, and the two of them were inseparable, really.
The stories about how connected to this horse that Alexander was are legendary in many respects, aren't they?
Yes,
and he named a city after his horse. Is that correct?
He did, completely correct. As I say, the horse died. He must have been in his 30s in what's today Pakistan. We don't know where. It's never been found. It was presumably just a little village, which was then renamed Bukefala. And that's where the horse was buried. There's famous burial scenes in the Iliad. And one of Alexander's best mates, a man called Hephaestion, was given the sort of funeral when he died in Asia that Achilles gave to his best mate, Patroclus, in the Iliad. So there's a direct influence of the Iliad. This is the text that Alexander's carrying around, which had been annotated by Aristotle.
So how common were those sorts of practices? The reason I asked the question is, were those sorts of practices, those funeral practices, for example, were they sort of mythic in status, or were they practices that were being used at the time? And to some degree, Alexander used it, for example, on Hephaestion and his horse as more of a symbolic gesture that was from the past.
Partly a tribute to Homer, but totally exceptional, because most ordinary horses probably wouldn't be given a formal burial at all, no ceremony. And most ordinary Greeks, men and women, would be buried in a very simple grave. But go to Aeges today, which is Vergina, and famously in the 1970s, Manolis Andronikos excavated a huge mound and found within it 3 royal tombs. Big argument, which king was buried in which, and that's still going on. But of course, none of them was Alexander, because Alexander died in Babylon, and that's another story. He was meant to be taken back, his remains, to Vergina, but they got hijacked and they were taken to Egypt, but that's another story. But the royal burial is one thing. Ordinary burial is something completely different.
I have to say, I was in those tombs some years ago, Nick and Paul, and it was absolutely unbelievable to be standing in those places and to see things like that wreath, the golden wreath that was being used. I mean, I struggle to think of any other tomb or a sort of funeral rite or anything like that has been so well preserved, other than, some of the, a lot of the stuff in Egypt. This is an impeccable example of archaeology and an insight into the funeral rites of these of this particular group of people, isn't it?
Well,
have you been to
Macedonians,
No, I haven't.
because the Macedonians were so wealthy, the royal house, from their conquests, from tribute, they were able to lavish their wealth on the funeral objects and to hire the absolutely best craftsmen from wherever in the Greek world to work for them. So we learn that, for example, Lysippus, who came from the Peloponnese, from Sicyon, he was Alexander's personal sculptor. And we learn that, and so on, so on. There are other people who are specialists in other crafts, and Alexander was able to hire particular geniuses. So this goes back to Philip, for sure, that practice of hiring the very best.
Just on Philip, I just want to get back to their relationship. What was that like? So here it was a checkered relationship they had, Alexander and Philip.
No. Well, here we get to an issue which I've been skirting, which is the evidence, the nature of the evidence. And one of the best sources, in the sense of fullest, most interesting, if you like, juicy, is Plutarch's biography of him. And that survives. Plutarch wrote parallel lives, so he compared a great Greek with a great Roman. And of course, the Roman that he compared Alexander to was Julius Caesar. So that gives you some idea of the level. Plutarch's writing about 100 AD, so well after the death even of Julius Caesar, who was murdered in 44 BC, so well over 100 years earlier. And Plutarch starts off his biography by saying, there is nothing that is said about Alexander by one person that is not contradicted in another source. So his point being that there's a terrific ton of literature, because Alexander was so famous that many people wrote about him, but Plutarch, having read it all, is a ferociously literate and learned man. He compared and contrasted his sources, who contradicted themselves. So what can you say? He also said, I'm writing not a history of Alexander, but a life of Alexander. So what did he mean by that? He meant, I'm not so interested in answering the question, why did Alexander want to conquer the Persian Empire? What was the effect of his conquering the Persian Empire? I'm much more interested in what were the things that Alexander most was interested by. What sort of facial features did he have? Did he have any strange tastes? So the little things as opposed to the big things that all together make up the man, rounded as a whole human being. So Plutarch's great, but for the history as opposed to the life, we rely on a guy a little bit after Plutarch. He's called Arrian. He's a Greek. His full name is Lucius Flavius Arrianus Xenophon, because he was a Roman citizen, though he was a Greek person. He came from northwest Asia Minor, northwest Turkey today, and he wrote a campaign history. So Alexander on campaign from 334 to his death in 323. Using earlier accounts, of course, he's writing hundreds of years after Alexander's death. At any rate, to get back to your question, everything we know about Alexander's first 20 years, almost everything, is contained in, I think it's 7 chapters of Plutarch's biography. So no other author was either interested in or able to get access to evidence for what Alexander did from the age of 0 to the age of 20. It's quite a striking fact. So that includes his relationship with his dad, because why did he become king at the age of 20? Because his father was assassinated. So the anecdotal evidence is that he and Philip got on very badly indeed towards his late teens. So Philip goes off campaigning when Alexander's 16. He goes off to the east against those Thracians I mentioned, and he leaves Alexander as regent, age 16. Amazing. Alexander's ruling Macedon, you're right. So you think they're getting on okay. Well, while Philip's away, Alexander engages in a campaign, and he renames a town not far from Pella, Alexandroupolis, not to be confused with the modern Alexandroupolis, but Alexander city. Well, Philip, imagine what Philip's thinking. Gosh, my son is sort of threatening me, age 16. And because his mother Olympias, long since had fallen out with Philip, one reason being Philip had, were they real wives or were they just relationships with whom he had children? He had 7 women whom one could call a wife. His principal wife was Olympias until she was replaced right at the end of Philip's life, and it's part of the reason why he died, by a lady called Cleopatra. Well, now imagine Olympias and Alexander falling out with Philip and getting on well with each other to plot against Philip. There's even a suggestion that Olympias was behind Philip's assassination, in which case Alexander, though he didn't do the deed, he too would have known full well what was going on and was in a position to seize the moment to make himself king. It's a pretty murky thing, but we just have to speculate.
So is that your view? So you think Olympia is definitely behind it, or what's your view on this?
Well, this is again an anecdote, but later on, once Alexander's become king and he's off campaigning, well, his mother's still on his back. She sends him messages. This is what you should do. This is what you shouldn't do. And he says, my mother charges me a very high rent for the 9 months she housed me in her womb. I think that
what a comment.
I think that's rather good. So I think Alexander wanted, once he'd become king, I think he wanted to be his own man. And so he's got rid of his father. He's off his back. He also wants Olympias off his back. And so he doesn't exactly fall out with her, but there's no closeness, if you like, after he becomes king.
Is this why he never wanted to come back?
It's been suggested. I mean, it's very notable that he never married a Macedonian woman, which would have been the absolutely bog standard thing for a king of Macedon or a future king of Macedon to do. Of course, age 20, he wouldn't normally be married. So his father died before Alexander would have reached the age of marriage. But by the time he was of a marriageable age, very significantly, he married 3 women eventually, all at the same time. I mean, he didn't marry them all at the same time, but they were all simultaneously his wives. None of them was a Greek or a Macedonian Greek. They were all Iranians, Asians.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh,
interesting.
What is the marriage age? Just
typically for a Greek male,
this is a certain age.
Yes, I mean, that's a very, in a way, crude thing. But if you've lived to the age of 20, statistically, you're likely to live till you're 50. Quite a few live beyond 50. So if you get married in your late 20s, you have children, by the time they're of an age, in other words, to be adult and succeed you, that's 20 to 30 years later. It all works out. So typically Greek males, free adult Greek males, wouldn't marry until they were, 25 minimum, normally 27, 28, 30, that sort of period.
I mean, we've covered that sort of early life, I guess. We've skimmed over, the early life of Alexander, his relationship with his father, his tutors, his education and whatnot. In any of what we know about Alexander during that period, was there any indication, do you think, that was there any indication that he would be genuinely great to some degree? Let's say.
Yeah. Well, I've given you
what was
one.
different about him?
I've given you one example. When he was made regent, age 16, he didn't just sit in Pella. He took off, conducted an expedition, successfully defeated, I forget which of the non-Greek neighbours, and then renamed their principal settlement after him, Alexandroupolis. So that was one sign. Another famous incident in his youth, I mentioned indirectly, when he tamed Bucephalus. He had some extraordinarily exceptional quality as a horseman, as somebody who would ride a horse and eventually, of course, into battle, into many battles. So those are the two that stand out. And apart from that, the seeking for independence, he and his mother, as I said, fell out with Philip. At one point, they were both exiled from Pella by Philip, and so were sort of waiting in the wings for things to improve, which they did when Philip decided to marry Cleopatra, that's his daughter, the full sister of Alexander, to Alexander of the Molossians in 336.
Okay, is that Cleopatra that you mentioned, was that Attilas's niece?
No, this is
at
Philip
the wedding. I think I read an article.
The other Cleopatra.
Okay,
I mean,
yeah,
there are many Macedonian Cleopatras. I mean, no, really, it is a Macedonian Greek name. And so the one you're thinking of, the niece of Atlas, is the woman that Philip married last. So she's his seventh wife, and he married her in 337, and she was pregnant in 336, and so Alexander might have thought, this is the first Macedonian Greek woman my dad's married. He's 46 now. He's just fathered. Well, what if it's a son she gives birth to? As it happened, it was. Maybe that guy's going to be brought up to be my rival. I won't be the successor. And that ties in with the fact that when Philip planned his campaign, he was already planning to go to Asia when he was assassinated. Alexander was not part of that expedition. He was to be left behind in Pella. So there are all these reasons coming together. At any rate, that's the Cleopatra who is the niece of Atlas, the wife of Philip. The other Cleopatra is Alexander's daughter. Alexander's sister, who is Philip and Olympias' daughter.
So now, obviously, we start to move into, these campaigns, amazing campaigns that this individual sort of led. And I mean, in terms of the legacy of those campaigns, what is the level of significance of Alexander's campaigns through? I mean, in terms of going from modern day Greece and Macedon through to as far afield as Pakistan. Had anything like that been done to that point?
No, absolutely immense. The Persian Empire of the Achaemenids was the biggest empire ever yet, so in human history, before, in other words, the unification of China. And to conquer it, millions of square miles, was almost unthinkable. But Alexander somehow had got it into his head that it was his destiny to go to the ends of the earth. And so as far as he was aware, if you keep going east, you eventually hit ocean. He didn't know about China, so he thought the east and hitting ocean would be somewhere round about Pakistan today, or Bangladesh and India, and then there would be nowhere further to go, as it were. And as it happens, that's as far as he got. Why did he want to do it at all? I mean, that's $1 million question. Partly it was to do better than his dad. His dad never, of course, got over to Asia, and it's not clear that he had in mind to do much more than just make make a big demonstration, free the Greek cities of Western Asia, and then come back to Macedon, whereas Alexander ploughed on, having won his battles in what we call Turkey. He goes on through the Levant and then into Egypt, and then, of course, all the way eventually to Iraq, and then eventually to Iran. Why? Driven. The sense of destiny, because he could. He was a genius leader of men, not only in battle, because of course he has to keep up the morale of these troops as they're spending years campaigning in very tough conditions, and the toughest of all are the conditions in Afghanistan. And he's one of the very few people who's ever conquered Afghanistan. It took him 3 years, and then it was pretty quickly lost because it's so difficult to keep it down. You have to constantly monitor the local tribes people. And if you would like me to tell you what I think are the major battles or the major events of his campaign, I can certainly do that for you. Well, what's striking about him, whereas previously, before him, to be a great general, you had to be a great general either of cavalry or of infantry, or in combination on land, or you had to be a great admiral of a fleet. Alexander, because Macedon had no fleet, they used Athenian ships to support the land-based campaign in Asia. Alexander was no admiral. He chose very skilled Cretans and people from the Cycladic islands to command his fleets. So he was a good delegator, but he was nowhere in the stakes for being a great admiral. However, what he was phenomenally great at was combining cavalry, and he himself rode as a cavalryman in the front line with various types of infantry, including new types of infantry which his father Philip had introduced, in particular infantrymen who wielded a pike that was about 18 foot long. It's called a sarissa, and that had never been used before, so it makes it very difficult for the enemy to get anywhere near the front line of a Macedonian army. But that wasn't all. In order to progress, he had to win 4 pitched battles, which combine infantry and cavalry. And he was fighting sometimes against chariots with scythed wheels, so that the wheels would chop you to pieces. He had to fight camels, which no Greek commander had ever had to fight war camels. At any rate, that's in terms of the
elephants, we understand as well.
And war elephants in India. Absolutely, completely right. There's a famous Raja. He's called Porus in Greek. Power of a Raja is about 2 meters high, apparently. And Alexander so respected him, having defeated him, that he allowed him to retain his kingdom. So he became a vassal king on the northwest frontier of Alexander's empire. But in addition to the battles, this is, I think, my main point, he also had to combat troops who were nestled at the top of mountain passes. He had to scale entire mountains in winter. He had to conduct sieges. The most difficult siege of all took him 9 months because it was of an island, which is just off the coast of the Levant, what we call Lebanon. And he was fighting against the Phoenicians of Tyre, Tyre, and he had to build a causeway to get to the island. Remembering that he didn't have very good fleet, he can't besiege it by ships. He has to attack it with troops, land troops, and it took him 9 months, but he so impressed the navy of his opponents that they came to his side. They decided that they would abandon the Persians. They were Persian subjects, and they would become subjects of Alexander.
I mean, this is one of the most amazing aspects, I think, personally, of Alexander, in the sense that wherever he went, he seemed to, a couple of things would happen. He would either adopt or sort of integrate the culture and the leadership and whatnot, he was very adept at bringing them onto his own side.
Absolutely.
I mean, are there any other marrying into the families and whatnot, particularly with his generals and whatnot? Can you talk a little bit about the significance of that? I mean, I can't think of any other example in antiquity where that sort of, I mean, I'll call it progressiveness, but I mean, where that sort of approach was taken.
There is a parallel, and it's a direct one because I think it's influenced, and it's the Roman Empire. Because the other great ancient empire, which pretty much covered the extent of Alexander's, though of course the Romans went way west, which Alexander didn't. He got only as far as Greece. He didn't invade Italy. His successors did. The Roman Empire, likewise, was very light in terms of its bureaucracy, using the locals, whom they raised up to the status of being Romans, though they were Syrians or Greeks or whatever they were. They were given Roman citizenship. Alexander had a notion, which was you have a Greek, a Macedonian usually, on the very top of the subdivisions, which were called satrapies, and these are the Persian original provinces, like a nomos in Greece. So you have at the top the governor. He then has a military commander and a financial controller, and their job is to keep the peace, to raise the tribute, and he would incorporate native sounds disrespectful, but I mean indigens. And the first one, a man called Mazias, was the man that he made controller, overall governor, a non-Greek, a Persian, for the first time to control Babylonia, which is southern Iran. Very significant province, rich and full of tradition, a major province of the old Persian Empire. So your point that Alexander somehow was able to insinuate himself into the local population, absolutely correct. He got into trouble, though, in one very important regard. He so valued his Persian followers, his non-Greek Asiatic followers, that he wanted to incorporate them in his royal court, together with his Macedonian Greeks and other Greeks who weren't Macedonians. They hated the idea. They couldn't understand why Alexander was willing to treat barbarians, because for Greeks, barbarians are on a lower level. If you don't speak Greek, you don't worship the Greek gods, and you don't practice Greek customs, you're an inferior, you're a barbarian. Alexander was raising them up to parity with them, and they thought that was terrible, and they rebelled. And if you like, plots against Alexander's life were discovered. They may have been invented, but nevertheless, Alexander was said to be worried about being assassinated, as his father, of course, had been.
Wow, great stories. We'd go forever with this, couldn't we, Tom?
Definitely.
I just want to touch on...
we'll spare you, Paul, don't worry.
We will. I just want to touch on Alexander. He was a king that would fight in the front line. Yeah. And quite often, most of his battles, he was outnumbered. So I guess my question is, was he the main guy for the strategy moving forward? Because you talked about the siege at Tyre, Battle of Assos, and all the other battles he's done. Who came up with a strategy to, heavily outnumbered, to take on an enemy, sometimes twice the size, and come out victorious? Who was the main guy behind all that?
He is. There's no question but that in the Council of War, he had his own view. He wasn't just waiting to hear what other people said. And it may be exaggerated, but he had a difference of opinion quite often with his senior general, whom he had inherited from Philip, a man called Parmenion. Macedonia is made up of what we call cantons. So you've got on the east is where the palace and the old Macedonian royal house lives. Then go west and you've got, some people call them barons, and basically it's more upland, whereas the east is more lowland. And one of the provinces, one of the baronies in the west, produced this man Parmenion, who was Philip's premier general. Well, there was a story that Parmenion would say, Alexander, if I were you, I wouldn't do what you're proposing to do. To which Alexander replies, but you're not me. And therefore I'm going to do what the hell I want. And so it is, I think the point of that story is that Alexander was bolder than Parmenion. Parmenion was perfectly correct in terms of experience and, as you say, the forces available, which were typically smaller. But Alexander knew that, and now this is a Napoleon quote, the morale factor is 3 times as important in warfare, i.e. winning battles, 3 times as important as all the other factors put together. Well, now, this is not a precise mathematical point. So what he means is strategy, tactics, weaponry, numbers of troops. No, more important is the spirit with which they fight. And in order to fight well, you have to have 2 things, basically. Well, 3, really. You have to be well-trained and well-equipped as you can. You have to believe in the cause, that it's worth potentially dying for. And thirdly, you have to fight for your commander. If he says this is the way to go, that's the way you go. And Alexander's, if you like, luck, but also brilliance, was that he kept winning by the scruff of his neck, by the skin of his teeth, just managed to pull it off when no one else would have done. And what then happens is an aura builds up around the commander that the troops think this guy must be a favorite of the gods. At his very first set-piece battle, he was about to be killed when one of his companions noticed the arm of the man, the Persian, trying to kill him, was coming down with his spear, and the man next to him cut that man's arm off. So Alexander could have died in the very first battle, the Battle of Granicus. No Alexander the Great. That was the difference between extraordinary success and total failure.
I can't help but think back to the documentary, the Greeks' Crucible of Civilization that you were involved in talking about that. The story of Cleisthenes and the fact that he was inspired by the heroes and that the aura that would have created and the level of inspiration that would have created.
Absolutely.
In many respects, did Alexander aspire as well to that heroic standard? And was that what was effectively rubbing off?
I mentioned Achilles, and what's most famous, apart from the fact that he was a brilliant fighter, is that he chose to live a glorious short life rather than an inglorious long life. And Alexander was just the same. So Achilles was the son of a local king, so he was a hero in that sense, but his mother was, of course, a goddess. Alexander believed that ultimately his ancestors, and this is a physical thing, were Heracles, and because Heracles was the son of Zeus. So he believed that he was divinely descended. He also believed that he was divinely sort of inspired, that these two, Heracles and Zeus, were particularly favorable to him. And then when he went to India, which is the furthest east that he got in 327, 326, 325, there were 2 famous Greeks, one Heracles, the other Dionysus, who had been to India before. Well, Alexander is said to have said, if they can go, so can I. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to conquer the Indians. Now, I raised before the issue, what did Alexander think he was doing? What's the point of all this conquering? He can do it, and it brings fame and glory. But apart from that, as it were, what's the point of those achievements? Maybe we can come back to that later.
I think we sort of touched on it. So he must have been a great athlete because when you're in battle, you're there for a long time. There's a lot of physical strength. So because he was in the front line so often, he must have been a great athlete, obviously.
Yeah, all of that. But he regularly was wounded, which would have weakened him. And once he went swimming. He went swimming and he caught some, I don't know, E. coli or whatever it was, and he was at death's door. So he had,
Not unlike the Olympians.
he had the best physicians, as I was saying about the craftsmen who made the goods that went into those tombs at Vergina. Alexander was surrounded by the greatest experts, the greatest geographers, best philosophers, best doctors. And one doctor in particular is said to have not once, but more than once, to have saved his life when others would have died. So yes, on the one hand, he was a terrific athlete, prodigiously strong. On the other hand, his body was taking a hell of a battering quite regularly throughout his campaigning career.
So how many times did he come close to death?
More than one could, if you like, count up easily, because I mentioned when at the very first Battle of the Granikos River, he was almost killed. Mm-hmm. That's just one example, but that must have happened, again. It just wasn't such an obviously significant instance. One reason it was significant was that the man who saved his life, Alexander later killed in a drunken rage in 328 in what's today called Samarkand in Uzbekistan. It's Marakanda in ancient Greek. So apart from that, there is one famous, notorious instance, and it doesn't reflect entirely well on Alexander. He's conquered the Persian Empire. He's got rid of the royal dynasty. He is the king of Persia. He's the king of Asia. And he wants to keep going, but his troops rebel. They've had enough. So this is the famous rebellion in 324 BC. He's got to come back from what is today Pakistan. And so he goes down the Indus to the Indian Ocean, and he then goes along to the west, along the Persian Gulf and the Makran Desert and so on. But in between having to turn back and hitting the Indian Ocean, he comes to a place called, we call it today Multan, and he's fighting against a local people who are well embedded behind a fort. He personally climbs up, and I think the story goes that he's the first over the top into the fortification, where he's isolated, and many of the locals set on him and leave him within an inch of his life. And so you could say, on the one hand, terrific heroism leading from the front, but also incredibly risky, and also why conquer these people? Why not just leave them alone? You're not going to directly rule them. They're too far away. So just go back, At any rate, the jury's out.
Wow.
And he did conduct a massacre. Once the place had been taken, in other words, the siege had succeeded, many of the inhabitants, presumably including non-combatants, were slaughtered. And it wasn't the first example.
Wow.
Alexander had been very, very tough, and his reasoning was, as an example, you don't want, as you're advancing, to find people rising up in rebellion behind you. So you make an example of significant towns so that people will say, oh, well, if that's what happens to rebels, I'm not going to rebel.
I want to talk a little bit about Alexander's personal life. And one of the things that sort of keeps popping up in antiquity is the relationship between men, young boys, and same sex relationships in many respects. I mean, obviously, Alexander did have relationships with other men. Tell us a little bit about his personal life in that respect. Yeah. What was the significance of it?
Well, he was, as I say, was not married till his late 20s, which is absolutely standard in ancient Greek practice. So what do men do for sex before that? Well, when they're adult, they can have younger, junior lovers. And it's absolutely standard thing, not peculiar to the Macedonians, but generically ancient Greek, not though universal. In other words, not everybody has the time or the leisure or the money to indulge in courtship and social relationships, which are also sexual, but not only sexual, between a young adult male not yet married and an adolescent male who is a prospective adult. And so modern people think of that as pederasty because the junior partner is a sub-adult, is a child. And the Greek word paiderastia means sexual desire for a pais, for a underage child. And that was not thought to be in itself immoral or unsocial or antisocial. It was thought to be a cultural practice that was organic and normal. And what we're not quite sure about, there is one man in particular with whom Alexander was particularly close, and I mentioned him already, Hephaestion. They were brought up together, they were taught together by Aristotle, and therefore they were probably about the same age, whereas the standard type of pederastic relationship is young adult with an adolescent, so age gap 2, 3, 4, 5 years. We don't know the names of any other males with whom Alexander is said to have had sex, apart from one Persian eunuch. And so that's another example of how unusual Alexander was, that he gets to Babylon and he finds a Persian boy. Mary Renault wrote a novel called The Persian Boy, and it's about their relationship. She wrote lots of novels of a homosexual kind. And this relationship obviously was transitory, was short-lived because Alexander moved on. But nevertheless, it was thought to be very meaningful for him. Other than that, he had sex with adult women who were all, as I've said, non-Greek, and they were Iranian. So he had a lady called Roxani was his first wife, and then 2 Persian princesses were his second and third. And before that, he'd had a relationship with a half-Greek, half-Persian woman with whom he had a child, and they called that child Heracles. And so he's not asexual and he's not homosexual, he's sexual.
Yeah.
You know, that's just how you want. But
that's how it was.
He is said to have said, there are 2 things that remind me of my mortality, that I will one day die. In other words, he doesn't want to die and he wants to be immortal like the gods. One of them is sleep, the other one is sex.
You reminded me of a quote. Again, I'm mentioning Stephen Fry here, but there was a quote during his debate with. Well, it was actually on the Parthenon marbles, actually, and he said something about pederasty. He said, by no means was Greece a perfect society. Pederasty was rife, but heck, I went to a public school. There's nothing new in all that.
Yeah, well, there, as I was saying,
one of his best.
Yeah, well, yes, but it wasn't pederasty because presumably Stephen was referring to sex with people of his own age. Whereas if a teacher in their 20s, now we have rules around that, and the ancients, they had rules. You've got to not be promiscuous. Right. You've got to observe. Say the father of a boy objects to you trying to get off with his son, then you mustn't get off with his son. There are rules, but it's just that the act in itself is not thought to be sinful or immoral, which is a Judeo-Christian legacy, and that's why homosexuals have had such a rough time.
That's very interesting. I did never sort of thought about that. I mean, so these were very socially acceptable relationships, even from a parent's perspective.
If you're Plato, at one point in Plato's career, he never married. He says that it's the only way to achieve that sort of amazing meeting of minds minds between the teacher, who is an adult, and the person being taught, who is an adolescent. And therefore, there's likely to be a sexual component. But their meeting of minds for higher, non-sexual purposes, but the harmony of the spirits, well, that's, of course, Plato. That is not a normal, typical view. But the point is that there was nothing, he didn't have to argue against the very fact of what we call homosexuality or pederasty.
I just wanted to ask, how many kids did Alexander the Great have? Was it just Hercules before we move on to his legacy and what happened after
Roxane
his death?
was pregnant when he died, and so she gave birth to a son after. But this is probably the time to bring in his death and what happened to his empire. The answer shortly is that it disappeared. It disintegrated, that there was no Alexander to take over from Alexander, and it was divided up broadly into three big territorial kingdoms, one based in Macedon in Greece, one based in Asia, and one based in Egypt. These are territorial monarchies, the Antigonids and the Seleucids in Asia and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Alexander's son didn't live long, probably was murdered at some point by one or other of the rivals who fought each other for about 50 years to see who would become the next Alexander, and none of them could do it. So apart from Hercules and this son, none that we know of. Which is one reason why there was nobody to fight for Alexander's legacy personally. There was nobody to defend Alexander, in the way that sons can.
And what can you tell us about his ultimate demise, his death?
Well, since his father was assassinated, and since assassination was quite common in the Macedonian royal house, because he died in, shall we say, extreme circumstances in Babylon in June 323, of some sort of very acute illness, the thought immediately arises he was poisoned and somebody therefore wanted him out of the way. And there is evidence that his immediate circle were unhappy that he was more keen to stay in Asia than to get back to Greece. They wanted to get back to Greece, many of them. At any rate, that's one possibility, that he was poisoned. We'll never know, because the corpse was taken eventually to Egypt and eventually to Alexandria. And so, of course, it's disappeared and we've no idea. We can't do a DNA or any other test on it. But other possibilities are that it was an infection caused by some virus, and various viruses have been proposed as the virus, and we'll never know. But I personally think the combination of the war wounds, the illnesses he'd had before, would have left him vulnerable to any very strong new virus in a new situation such as Babylon. Yeah, he hadn't been there before, and therefore he was vulnerable, and that he died by what I would call natural causes, but that wasn't sufficient for the gossip mongers.
Wow. Okay, well, that's fascinating stuff. But one last thing. So I understand when he died, they attempted to take his body back to Macedonia, but got hijacked, went to Egypt, and it was still around for, another 200 years, because we had, Roman generals visit him, and it was like a place to go and see. Where do you think his body may have ended up?
There are some interesting documentaries about it at the moment.
I know. The last, I think, historically valid claim is that Emperor Augustus visited Alexander, was then mummified and in a tomb, and broke off his nose. That sounds like it's a dig at the clumsiness of Augustus, but I think you don't make up that detail if Augustus hadn't actually visited the tomb. So where is the tomb? Well, it's underwater. I'm almost certain that the sea level has risen, and the royal quarter, the quarter also where the museum and library of Alexander Alexander were, they're all now underwater, and divers have been not digging, but physically raising from underwater bits and pieces of sculpture and so on. But I don't think we'll ever find the actual tomb, because I believe that tomb has physically disappeared into the depths. But we do
Unbelievable.
we do, on the other hand, have legacy, and this is something, it's a separate subject. But the myth or legend and legacy of Alexander is promoted throughout the Western world and into Asia, into Arabia, by various means. The main literary vehicle being the Alexander Romance, which was first of all composed in Alexandria several hundred years after Alexander's death. But I'll give you just one fact which it claims, and you won't believe this, that his father was not Philip. No, his father was Nectanebus or Nectanebo, who was the last pharaoh of Egypt before the Persians reconquered Egypt, and then Alexander conquered the Persians. So what that does is give Alexander a legitimacy to the throne of Egypt by birth.
Yes.
And so it's complete nonsense as fact, because how does Nectanebus get to Pella to meet Olympias and have sex with her? At any rate, there are lots of legends like that which are fascinating.
Well, the only thing that we can be very certain of is that this is a story, and this is in many ways, a symbol that has served to unite many Greeks. And, there's obviously that sort of pride that Greeks feel, and to the point where so many other people have tried to claim him as well. I mean, it really speaks to the legacy of this individual and how important he was.
He's one of only two people that I know of whose name has been enfolded into Megalexandros, and in France, Charlemagne. Same point, Karl der Grosse in German becomes Charles de Magnus in French. So he was so great that his greatness was thought to be a part of him. There are bad sides. I've mentioned one or two. I'm not trying to paint him as a saint, but he was, both in ancient Greek terms and in my terms, a hero. Without parallel. I think really there is no parallel as a conqueror, except maybe Genghis Khan. He's greater than Napoleon because he never suffered a major defeat. And on the other hand, his legacy in terms of literature and art, the whole of the Middle East was Hellenized by the conquests of Alexander the Great. Whether he intended that, whether that was the point or it was just a consequence. For example, the Buddha, an Indian person originally, is first ever portrayed as a human being. There'd been no statues of the Buddha until after Alexander the Great. The Indians of that time, in the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century, they thought it was so natural to depict even a great divine person as a human being, which was a very Greek thing. So he's had an impact on other cultures, in this case Buddhism. Absolutely amazing.
I mean, that could be a podcast all of its own. The artistic impact of those conquests.
Absolutely.
There's so many ways. Yeah. There's so many ways that we could look at this.
And even his influence. You mentioned Napoleon and Julius Caesar. I'm sure these great kings and leaders would have had a massive influence from Alexander the Great and people today, I guess. So the legacy continues to live on.
It does. Yeah. Now, I'm not a monarchist myself. I don't know about you guys. I'm a very determined Republican. So I'm not keen on the influence of Alexander being positive insofar as he was a king. But in all other ways, I'm willing to give him a free pass.
I'll agree with you on that.
Nice, Paul.
We could genuinely talk we could dedicate an entire series to Alexander if we really wanted to. But
right.
I mean, the key thing is, Professor Paul Cartledge has written books on the subject. Look up the catalog. Those books are by and large available all over the world. I mean, just jump online. I'm sure you'll be able to find them.
Even YouTube.
Yeah, I mean,
yes,
documentaries.
YouTube.
I've
I'm
seen
sorry
a
to
few of
say.
yours on there as well.
well, look, for those wanting to read up more on the subject, please do look up Professor Paul Cartledge's books, and look up his lectures, or just listen to this podcast again. We really appreciate everyone taking the time to celebrate, let's say, this amazing person and someone who is so culturally important to us. Professor Paul Cartledge, thank you so much for coming back to Ouzo Talk. It's been an absolute honor.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Nick. Yachara, and have a great rest of today.
And apologies for going over time.
Oh.
So we will reach out to you again. But look, thank you so much again on behalf of me and Tom. Look, it's been great. We could have gone for another 5 hours. But
absolutely.
I know we're all short of time, but it was brilliant.
Thank you. ouzotalk@outlook.com is the email. Follow us on social media @ouzotalk and @ouzo_talk, as well as on YouTube. Nick Athanasiou, Professor Paul Cartledge. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, everyone.
Ακολουθήστε μας στο Soundees, στο Spotify, στο Apple Podcasts και στο Google Podcasts.